A morning that changed everything. The morning began with an unsettling chill, the kind that lingered in the air long after the sun rose. The streets of Glenridge were quieter than usual, the rain from the night before leaving the asphalt shimmering under the pale light. Officer Daniel Roberts, a veteran with 15 years on the force, sipped his coffee in the patrol car, idly scrolling through his phone. A seasoned officer, Daniel had a reputation for being firm, but his actions often blurred the line between justice and his personal biases. That morning, Daniel's routine patrol took him through West Park, a historically underfunded part of town. The neighborhood bore the scars of decades of neglect: cracked sidewalks, faded storefronts, and graffiti on every corner. Despite the vibrant culture and resilience of its residents, the area was often the target of unfair scrutiny, especially from law enforcement. Daniel's gaze wandered until it caught something unusual. A young black woman walked briskly down the sidewalk, her hands gripping a sleek leather tote. Her appearance caught his attention, not because she did anything suspicious, but because of her elegance. She was dressed sharply in a tailored coat and boots, her hair neatly styled, and her posture confident. His instincts, conditioned by years of prejudice disguised as vigilance, kicked in. "What's a girl like that doing around here?" he muttered to himself. The question wasn't about her safety. It was about whether she belonged. He put the coffee cup in the holder, turned on his signal light, and steered the patrol car to the curb. Parking with precision, Daniel stepped out, straightening his utility belt as he approached her. His heavy boots splashed against the damp sidewalk, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent street. "Excuse me, miss," he called, his tone authoritative. The woman stopped, her brow furrowing slightly as she turned to face him. Her eyes, dark and perceptive, met his without hesitation. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Mind if I see some ID?" Daniel asked, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. He noted the tote bag, her polished demeanor, and an expensive-looking watch glinting under her sleeve. It all fueled his suspicion. "Is there a reason?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Her question was not confrontational but measured, a careful balance of defiance and caution. Daniel frowned, his jaw tightening. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," he lied smoothly. "Just a routine check." The woman raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his vague justification. "I see," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out her wallet and handed over her ID, her movements deliberate. "Here you go." Daniel scrutinized the card, his eyes darting between her face and the name printed on the plastic. Imani Sinclair. The name felt vaguely familiar, though he couldn't place it. She lived in the neighborhood, or so the ID claimed. Still, his gut told him there was something more to her, something she was hiding. "Where are you headed, Miss Sinclair?" he asked, holding her ID just out of her reach. "Home," she said simply, her tone clipped. She extended her hand, waiting for him to return her card. "Am I free to go now?" Daniel hesitated, his pride flaring at her confidence. Something about her composure irked him, made him feel small in a way he couldn't quite understand. He decided to push further. "Do you have anything in that bag I should know about?" he asked, his voice taking on a harder edge. Imani's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm not obligated to answer that." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Cooperation goes a long way, Ms. Sinclair." Imani exhaled, a slight tremor in her hand betraying her otherwise steady demeanor. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. If you're accusing me of something, please state it clearly." Her words landed like a slap. Daniel felt the weight of the bystanders who had started to gather. A middle-aged man stood a few feet away, watching the exchange with a wary expression. A woman with a stroller paused to glance back. Even the morning joggers slowed their pace, their eyes flitting nervously between Daniel and Imani. "Let me see the bag," Daniel demanded, his voice louder now. "No," Imani said firmly, clutching the strap tighter. "Not without a warrant." The confrontation escalated. Daniel grabbed the strap, pulling it roughly from her shoulder. The force caused Imani to stumble, her balance momentarily lost. She regained her footing and stepped back, her chest heaving as she glared at him. "Enough," she said, her voice rising. "This is harassment." "Stay quiet," Daniel barked, opening the bag and emptying its contents onto the wet sidewalk. A phone, a slim laptop, a makeup pouch, and a notebook spilled out. Nothing remotely suspicious. Still, he rummaged through the items with exaggerated force, his frustration mounting. "You've got a lot of nerve," he muttered, tossing the bag aside. Imani crouched to gather her belongings, her hands trembling slightly. "You're abusing your authority," she said quietly, her voice laced with barely restrained anger. Daniel ignored her, but something in his chest twisted. A flicker of doubt, quickly buried under the weight of his ego. He stood up, towering over her as she straightened and met his gaze again. "You've made a big mistake," she said, her voice steady now. Her words weren't a threat but a declaration, filled with quiet conviction. Before Daniel could respond, the distant hum of an engine grew louder. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver's door opened, and a man in an impeccably tailored suit stepped out. His presence immediately drew the attention of the small crowd. He walked with a quiet authority, his expression neutral but commanding. Daniel stiffened, his hand instinctively hovering near his belt. The man's eyes flicked between him and Imani before he spoke, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Is there a problem here, Officer Roberts?" the man asked. Daniel's chest tightened. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a badge, flashing it just long enough for Daniel to register the insignia of the Department of Justice. Imani's lips curved into a faint smile, her gaze steady as she met Daniel's increasingly uncertain eyes. "Looks like your day just got a lot more complicated," the man said, his tone icy. The unraveling. The air felt thick as the man in the tailored suit stepped closer, his sharp eyes locked on Officer Daniel Roberts. Around them, the crowd began to swell, people pulling out their phones, their whispers rising in intensity. Daniel could feel his authority slipping away, replaced by the weight of scrutiny. "Officer Roberts," the man said again, this time with a clipped edge to his voice. "You didn't answer my question. Is there a problem here?" Daniel straightened his back, his hand still hovering near his belt, as though the simple act of reaching for his weapon would reassert his dominance. "This is a routine stop," he replied, his tone curt. "Just ensuring everything checks out." The man's eyes darted to the items scattered on the wet pavement, Imani's phone, laptop, and personal belongings, and then to Imani herself, who was standing now, her arms crossed defensively, her chin held high despite the humiliation. The man nodded slightly, taking in the scene. "Routine, you say?" He bent down and picked up the notebook from the sidewalk, flipping it open. "Doesn't look like contraband to me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, who are you to question my actions?" The man stood, sliding the notebook back into Imani's bag before handing it to her. He reached into his pocket again and produced a sleek, leather-bound folder. Opening it, he revealed an ID card bearing the seal of the Department of Justice, along with his name, Julian Harper, Special Counsel. "I have every right to question you, Officer," Julian said, his voice calm but unyielding. "You're detaining someone without probable cause on record, in full view of witnesses." Daniel's confidence faltered for a moment. His eyes darted to the growing crowd, to the phone till the loft, recording every second. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He took a step forward, squaring his shoulders. "Look, Mr. Harper," Daniel said, his voice sharpening. "This young lady matched a description, and her behavior was suspicious. I'm just doing my job." Julian tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Matched a description? Of what exactly? Carrying a notebook and a laptop while walking in her own neighborhood. Daniel flushed, the heat rising to his face. "It's not your place to interfere." "Interfere?" Julian's voice dropped, cold and cutting. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Officer Roberts, and you clearly don't understand the consequences of your actions." Before Daniel could respond, another car pulled up, a black SUV with tinted windows. The door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. He was older, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his tailored suit radiating authority. His presence alone silenced the murmurs of the crowd. Imani's expression softened as the man approached, a hint of relief washing over her features. "Dad," she said, her voice low but steady. The man, Elijah Sinclair, placed a hand on her shoulder and gave her a reassuring nod before turning his gaze to Daniel. His eyes were sharp, like a blade poised to strike, but his voice remained measured. "Is this the man who thought it appropriate to harass my daughter?" Elijah asked, his words slow and deliberate. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. He felt the ground beneath him shift, as though the weight of his actions was finally catching up to him. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "But I was acting within the scope of my duties." "Acting within the scope of your duties," Elijah repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "By assaulting an innocent young woman, by tearing through her belongings on a public sidewalk." Daniel took a step back, his confidence wavering. "I didn't assault anyone," he said defensively. "I was just—" "Enough," Elijah said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. He turned to Julian. "Do we have everything we need?" Julian nodded, pulling out his phone. "Footage, witnesses, and her statement will be enough to start." He looked at Daniel. "You've just made a grave mistake, Officer Roberts. I hope you're ready to face the consequences." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Daniel's stomach churned as he realized the full weight of the situation. This wasn't going to blow over. These weren't people he could intimidate or silence. They were prepared, organized, and, most importantly, determined. Elijah turned back to Imani, his expression softening. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Imani nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "I just want to go home." "Of course," Elijah said, his voice gentle now. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the onlookers. "Thank you for bearing witness," he said, "but I urge you to take this moment and reflect on what you've seen. This is not just about my daughter. It's about a system that allows people like this to act with impunity. It's time we hold them accountable." The crowd murmured in agreement, some clapping softly, others nodding with solemn expressions. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of collective resolve. As Elijah and Imani walked toward the SUV, Julian stayed behind, his eyes fixed on Daniel. "You might want to get a lawyer," he said quietly. "You're going to need one." Daniel stood frozen as the SUV drove away, leaving him alone on the sidewalk. The crowd began to disperse, but the weight of their judgment lingered. For the first time in his career, Daniel felt truly powerless. The illusion of control shattered. He picked up his radio and called in a report, his voice shaky. "Dispatch, this is Officer Roberts. I need to file an incident report." But even as he spoke, he knew there was no saving his career or his reputation. The story was already out, spreading like wildfire. And this was just the beginning. The storm breaks. Daniel Roberts sat alone at his kitchen table at night, his hands gripping a cold cup of coffee. The room was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator, but in his mind, the echoes of the day's events replayed in an endless loop. The name Elijah Sinclair burned in his memory like a brand, and the icy authority in Julian Harper's voice haunted him. The TV in the corner flickered to life, a local news broadcast spilling across the screen. Daniel's stomach dropped as he saw a familiar face, his own. The grainy footage of his confrontation with Imani played, the sound crisp enough to capture every insult, every accusation. The anchor's voice cut through his thoughts. "Breaking news tonight. Glenridge police officer Daniel Roberts is at the center of a growing controversy after a viral video shows him forcibly detaining a young woman without cause. The woman, identified as Imani Sinclair, is the daughter of prominent civil rights attorney Elijah Sinclair. Sources say the Department of Justice is already investigating the incident. Daniel's heart pounded as the camera shifted to a press conference. Elijah Sinclair stood at a podium, his towering frame and calm demeanor commanding attention. Cameras flashed as he began to speak. "This is not just about my daughter," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about the unchecked abuse of power, about the systemic bias that permeates our institutions. Imani's experience is one that far too many people of color face every day. This ends now." The room erupted in applause, and Daniel's face twisted in anger. He grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, but the damage was done. He could still see Elijah's piercing eyes, still hear the applause, and still feel the weight of the public's judgment. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. He picked it up reluctantly, his heart sinking when he saw the caller ID. "Sergeant Keller." "Roberts." Keller barked as soon as Daniel answered. "Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've made?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Sarge, I was just doing my job. She was acting suspicious." "Spare me the excuses," Keller interrupted. "The Sinclair family isn't just any family, Roberts. Elijah Sinclair is connected. His name carries weight. And his daughter? She's not some random kid off the street. Do you even know who Marcus Sinclair is?" Daniel frowned. "Should I?" Keller groaned, the sound filled with exasperation. Marcus Sinclair was a civil rights legend. He's Elijah's father and Imani's grandfather. That family is untouchable. "Roberts, you've stirred up a hornet's nest." The line went silent for a moment, the weight of Keller's words pressing down on Daniel. He felt a growing sense of dread, like a noose tightening around his neck. "So what happens now?" Daniel asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens now?" Keller repeated, his tone incredulous. "Now, we're in full damage control. You're suspended, effective immediately. Internal Affairs is opening an investigation, and you'd better pray they find something. Anything that saves your sorry ass." The call ended abruptly, leaving Daniel staring at the screen in disbelief. Suspended. Internal Affairs. His mind raced, trying to piece together a way out of the situation. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. The system he'd relied on to protect him was already beginning to turn its back. The Sinclair strategy. Across town, the Sinclair family gathered in the living room of their stately home. The atmosphere was tense but purposeful, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing outside. Imani sat on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, as her father paced back and forth. Her grandfather, Marcus Sinclair, sat in an armchair, his sharp eyes fixed on a legal pad where he jotted notes. "Imani," Elijah said gently, stopping in front of her. "I know today was difficult, but we need to be strategic. This isn't just about you. This is about holding the system accountable." Imani nodded, her voice trembling slightly. "I understand, Dad, but I don't want to be a pawn in some political game." "This isn't a game," Marcus interjected, his voice low and commanding. "This is a fight we've been waging for generations. What happened to you today was unacceptable, but it's not unique. If we don't act, it will happen again, and worse." Imani looked at her grandfather, the weight of his words settling over her. She knew he was right, but the thought of becoming the face of a national movement was overwhelming. She had always admired her family's work, but never imagined she'd be thrust into the center of it. Elijah sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "You're not alone in this," he said. "We'll stand with you every step of the way. But we need to move quickly. The media is already on this, and public opinion is shifting. This is our moment." Imani took a deep breath and nodded. "What do we do first?" "We build a coalition," Elijah said. Julian's already reaching out to allies in the DOJ, and we'll need statements from community leaders, activists, and anyone else willing to stand with us. But the most important thing is your voice, Imani. People need to hear your story." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Your voice is your power," he said, "but it must be measured, deliberate. Anger won't win this fight. Conviction will." Imani nodded again, her resolve growing. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." The backlash. By morning, the story had exploded. Social media was ablaze with hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Imani. Hashtag Hold the Line. Hashtag End Police Abuse. News outlets across the country ran the footage on a loop, analyzing every second of Daniel's actions. The Sinclair family's press conference was the top story, their powerful words resonating with millions. But not everyone was on their side. Pundits and commentators began to surface, questioning Imani's intentions, digging into her past for any scrap of controversy. The Sinclair family anticipated this, but it still stung. At the same time, Daniel's face became synonymous with everything wrong with the system. Protesters gathered outside his apartment, chanting for justice. His neighbors avoided him, their once friendly nods replaced with cold glares. Even his closest colleagues stopped answering his calls. The walls were closing in, and Daniel knew it. But the worst was yet to come. The fire spreads. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the dense clouds over Glenridge, as though even nature sensed the unrest gripping the city. Outside Daniel Roberts' apartment, a swelling crowd of protesters gathered, their chants echoing through the streets. Signs waved in the air: "Justice for Imani. End police brutality. No more racism in blue." The tension in the air was palpable, and Daniel, watching from his window, felt it seeping into his bones. He hadn't slept. His kitchen table was cluttered with half-empty coffee cups in his phone, which vibrated endlessly with notifications. News updates, messages from reporters, and social media mentions lit up the screen, but Daniel couldn't bring himself to read them. The few times he had, the comments were vicious. He was being vilified in real time, his name and face plastered across every platform as the epitome of corruption and racism. A loud knock at the door startled him. He jumped, his nerves frayed. For a moment, he debated ignoring it, but the knocking grew louder and more insistent. "Roberts," the voice barked. "Open up. It's Keller." Reluctantly, Daniel opened the door to find Sergeant Keller standing there, his face red and his expression severe. Behind him, two other officers stood, their gazes cold and distant. Keller pushed past Daniel, his boots tracking mud onto the worn carpet. "Close the door," Keller ordered. Daniel obeyed, the heavy thud of the door shutting feeling like the final nail in his coffin. "What's this about?" Daniel asked, his voice shaky. Keller turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "This is about the department cleaning house," he said. "You've put us in a damn mess. Roberts, do you have any idea what's happening out there?" Daniel gestured toward the window. "I can see it. But this isn't all on me." Keller slammed a folder onto the table, cutting him off. "Don't even start. You think this is about one incident. They're digging into everything, Roberts. Every complaint, every use of force report, every shady interaction you've ever had. And guess what? They're finding plenty." Daniel's stomach dropped as he stared at the folder. "That's not fair," he muttered. "I did what I had to do. I was following protocol." Keller leaned in, his voice low and venomous. "Protocol doesn't cover beating a defenseless woman, pulling her bag apart on a public street, and shouting racist garbage while the whole damn world is watching. You've embarrassed the department, and now they're making an example out of you." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means you're done," Keller said. "Effective immediately, your suspension is upgraded to termination. Internal Affairs has all they need, and the DA is preparing charges. I suggest you lawyer up." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Charges? For what? For assault, misuse of authority, and God knows what else they'll tack on once they're done digging, Keller said. You're on your own now. Keller motioned to the other officers who stepped forward. We need your badge and weapon, he said. Daniel hesitated, but the cold stares of his former colleagues left no room for negotiation. With shaking hands, he unclipped his badge and holster, placing them on the table. The weight of the items felt like a physical representation of everything he'd lost. As Keller and the officers left, Daniel sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The chants outside grew louder, the voices of the protesters blending into a single, unrelenting roar. The Sinclair movement. Across town, the Sinclair household was abuzz with activity. Elijah Sinclair stood at the head of the dining table, a laptop open in front of him, while Julian Harper and Marcus Sinclair reviewed a stack of papers. Imani sat nearby, scrolling through her phone as messages of support poured in from across the country. Seattle, Chicago, New York. They're all holding solidarity protests. Imani said, her voice tinged with both awe and exhaustion. This is bigger than us. That's the point. Elijah said, his tone firm. We're not just fighting for you, Imani. We're fighting for every person who's ever been treated like they don't matter. Julian nodded. The DOG is already escalating their investigation into the Glen Ridge Police Department. This could lead to a full-blown federal oversight. Marcus, who had been silent until now, leaned back in his chair. Good, he said, but it's not enough. We need policy changes, funding for community programs, and a shift in the narrative. This can't just be about taking down one officer. It has to be about dismantling the system that enables him. Imani looked up, her eyes meeting her grandfather's. And what about me? She asked. What happens when this is over? Will I ever have a normal life again? Marcus's expression softened. No, my dear, he said gently. But what you'll have is far more important. You'll have a legacy, a voice that can inspire change. Elijah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll get through this together. Imani, you're stronger than you know. A reckoning begins. That evening, the Sinclair family held a rally in the heart of Glen Ridge. Thousands gathered in the square, their signs and voices filling the night with a palpable sense of hope and determination. The stage was flanked by banners that read, Justice for Imani, and Change the System. Imani stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding as she faced the sea of people. Cameras flashed, and the crowd erupted into cheers. She took a deep breath and began to speak. I stand before you tonight, not just as a victim, but as a voice for everyone who has ever been silenced, she said. What happened to me was wrong, but it's not unique. We've all seen it, on the news, in our communities, in our own lives. And we've all said, enough is enough. The crowd roared in agreement, their energy fueling her resolve. This isn't just about me, she continued. This is about justice. It's about accountability. And it's about building a future where no one has to live in fear of those sworn to protect them. Her words echoed through the square, carried by the voices of the crowd as they chanted her name. The Sinclair family stood behind her, their presence a reminder of the strength found in unity. Daniel's isolation. Meanwhile, Daniel sat alone in his darkened apartment, the muffled sounds of the rally audible even from a distance. He stared at his phone, the screen filled with messages, some supportive, most condemning. He couldn't escape the weight of what he'd done, or the reality of what was to come. For the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong. If the system he had trusted and upheld for so long was flawed, if he was part of the problem. But before he could dwell on the thought, a loud crash startled him. He rushed to the window to see that someone had thrown a brick through his car windshield. Attached to it was a note. You'll pay for what you've done. Fear gripped him as he realized that his life as he knew it was over. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. The collapse. The days following the rally were a blur of chaos for Daniel Roberts. The constant barrage of phone calls and messages, the whispered gossip in the few places he dared to visit. Everything felt like a reminder of his fall from grace. His once pristine reputation had crumbled to dust, and with it, the illusion of control he had long relied upon. Every street he walked down seemed to hum with the weight of judgment. His old colleagues, once friendly faces in the precinct, avoided him as though he were a leper. The media frenzy surrounding the incident escalated with each passing hour. His face was on every news station, every front page. The hashtags #JusticeForAmani and #EndPolicedBrutality trended worldwide. Stories emerge, one after another, painting a damning picture of his behavior, excessive force, racial profiling, and even past complaints that had somehow been swept under the rug for years. Witnesses came forward, some who had seen similar abuses from Daniel in the past, others who had once been too afraid to speak out. The public began to rally behind Amani and her family, their story becoming a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice. But it wasn't just the external pressure that Daniel struggled with, it was the crushing isolation. His phone, once a lifeline to friends and acquaintances, now sat in his apartment, silent and useless. His wife, Sarah, had packed her bags and left with their children. The note she had left on the kitchen table, simple but devastating, echoed in his mind. "I can't live with this. Not anymore." She had packed up their things and left without a single word, leaving Daniel alone to face the fallout of his own actions. His phone had buzzed with messages from her, angry, pleading, then cold. It didn't matter now. She was gone. His parents, too, had distanced themselves. His father had been a former officer, one who had always prided himself on the badge, but now even his father refused to speak to him. When Daniel tried to call his brother, the call went unanswered. The family that had once been a pillar of support had turned its back on him. All of the relationships he had taken for granted now felt fragile, as if they had never truly been solid in the first place. Daniel paced back and forth in his dimly lit living room, his eyes darting between the flickering images on the TV screen. A new development had emerged. The Department of Justice had officially opened an investigation into the Glenridge Police Department, with Daniel's actions at the center. Julian Harper, the special counsel who had intervened on Amani's behalf, had made a public statement just hours ago, calling for federal oversight and systemic reform in law enforcement. As the words of Harper's speech echoed in Daniel's mind, he couldn't help but feel the weight of their condemnation. "This is a moment for change," Harper had said. "This is a moment for accountability." But accountability was the last thing on Daniel's mind. What plagued him now wasn't just the legal repercussions, the potential charges or the protests. It was the feeling that he had lost something far more significant. The trust he had placed in the very system he had been a part of for so long. That system, once a fortress of protection, had turned on him the moment he crossed a line. He had thought that the badge gave him power, but now it felt like a curse. The consequences. The next morning, Daniel's phone rang. The name on the screen sent a jolt of fear through his chest. Internal Affairs. He answered the call, his throat dry. "Roberts," he said, his voice unsteady. A cold, professional voice greeted him. "This is Agent Harris from Internal Affairs. We've reviewed the evidence in your case, including the video footage and witness statements. You've been accused of excessive force, racial discrimination, and violations of departmental protocols. As of today, you are officially under investigation." Daniel's stomach twisted. "I didn't. I wasn't the only one." "Officer Roberts," Harris interjected, her voice steely. "The investigation is ongoing. At this point, we are collecting further testimonies. You're suspended from all duties until further notice. Expect a formal hearing within the next week." The line went dead before Daniel could respond, leaving him reeling. Suspended. He had always been the one to dish out consequences, to hold others accountable. But now it was his turn to face them, and it felt suffocating. The walls were closing in. As the days passed, the storm around Daniel only grew fiercer. The protests had expanded, gaining momentum with each passing hour. What had started as a localized movement was now a nationwide outcry. The footage of Daniel's confrontation with Imani had gone viral, reaching millions of people across the globe. Social media posts flooded in, calling for Daniel to be held accountable. Messages of support for Imani and her family poured in from activists, celebrities, and everyday people alike. Despite his isolation, Daniel couldn't escape the media's gaze. Reporters camped outside his apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse of the disgraced officer. The pressure was unrelenting. Every time he left his apartment, he was met with sneers, shouts, and cold glares from strangers. He tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. His once ordinary life had become a spectacle, and he was the villain in his own story. The guilt gnawed at him constantly. He couldn't escape the image of Imani's face, her cold, unwavering stare as he had pushed her to the ground. He had tried to break her, to assert his dominance, but it was clear now. She had never been afraid. She had faced his cruelty with strength and resilience, and now she had the world behind her. The Sinclair family's next move. Meanwhile, the Sinclair family was preparing for the next phase of their battle. Imani's voice had become a beacon for change, and she was determined to use it. The nationwide support had shifted the narrative in a way that even Elijah Sinclair hadn't fully expected. The family had been approached by several high-profile lawyers and civil rights organizations offering their support. A coalition had formed, consisting of activists, lawmakers, and community leaders, all working together to push for justice. But it wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed officers like him to exist without consequence. In a private meeting later that evening, Elijah stood with Marcus, Imani, and Julian. The weight of their plan was palpable, and Imani could feel the tension in the room. They had made it clear that they weren't going to stop until they saw real change. "We've got their attention," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Now it's time to make sure we're heard. We push forward with the lawsuits, the investigation, and we don't let up. We get to the root of this. Everything from training practices to police funding, and we hold people accountable, starting with Roberts." Imani nodded, a sense of determination settling over her. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "We can't let this slide. Not now. Not ever." Marcus looked at his granddaughter with pride. "You're stronger than you know," he said. "But this fight, it's not about revenge. It's about making sure the next generation doesn't have to live through what we did." Daniel's final decision. Back in his apartment, Daniel sat in the dark, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. He had barely touched it, but the bottle was a comforting presence, a way to numb the overwhelming sense of dread that had consumed him. His thoughts swirled, consumed by guilt, fear, and anger. The city around him felt like it was closing in, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. Suddenly, his phone rang again. This time, the number was unfamiliar. He hesitated before answering. "Daniel Roberts," he said, his voice hoarse. "Officer Roberts," a familiar voice said, cutting through the fog of his mind. It was Keller. "You need to get out. You're being transferred. No more patrol work, no more desk work. Internal Affairs is escalating the investigation. They're coming for you." Daniel's heart raced. "What do you mean, coming for me?" "They're taking everything," Keller said grimly. "The badge, the gun, the house. They're moving fast. You're not just being fired, Daniel. You're being exposed." The reckoning. The morning air was unusually cold, cutting through Daniel Roberts as he stepped out of his apartment for the first time in days. His eyes were bloodshot, the weight of sleepless nights and the constant hum of his spiraling thoughts weighing heavily on his frame. His every step felt measured, as though he was walking through a nightmare he couldn't escape. Every corner he turned, every passerby he encountered, seemed to stare at him with a mixture of judgment and disgust. His once familiar surroundings now felt foreign, hostile even, as though the world had shifted and left him behind in its wake. His phone buzzed again, a reminder of the relentless storm that was now his life. The screen displayed a news alert. Federal investigation expands into Officer Roberts' actions. Another headline, another reminder that the web of consequences he had woven was tightening, squeezing the last bits of hope from his chest. It wasn't just about his job anymore. It was about everything he had built, or thought he had built. The respect, the authority, the trust in the system that had protected him for so long. But now it was all crumbling, and he couldn't stop it. The shame of his actions felt like a crushing weight, pushing him lower each day. The memory of Imani's calm, unwavering eyes as he had tried to break her still haunted him. He could still hear her voice in his head, the words that had cut deeper than any physical blow. "You don't know what you've done." His hand instinctively reached for his pocket, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface of his badge, the symbol of everything he had once believed in. But it felt like nothing more than a burden now. He had lost that power, that illusion of control. As he walked down the street, the realization settled deeper into his bones. He had no place left here. The media firestorm. The media frenzy surrounding Daniel had reached a fever pitch. As he shuffled back into his apartment later that afternoon, he could hear the faint hum of TV broadcasts echoing down the hall. When he turned on his own television, the first thing he saw was his face again. His features were distorted in high definition, his every move dissected by countless talking heads. Daniel Roberts, a disgraced officer, has become the focal point of a national conversation on police brutality and systemic racism, the anchor announced, her voice dripping with condemnation. Footage released last week shows Roberts physically assaulting Imani Sinclair, a young black woman, as she walked through her own neighborhood. The incident, which has sparked outrage nationwide, has ignited widespread protests and calls for immediate reform in law enforcement. The news footage rolled, showing the same video of Imani's detention, his harsh treatment, his crude words, his humiliating actions. Every frame was a reminder of his failure and the disgust on the faces of the people who had witnessed it. Daniel's stomach churned as the reporter's voice continued. Meanwhile, community leaders are joining Imani Sinclair and her family in their fight for justice. Civil rights leaders have issued statements calling for accountability, with some urging the Department of Justice to intervene at the federal level. The screen cut to Elijah Sinclair speaking at a rally in front of a crowd of thousands. "This isn't just about Imani," Elijah said, his voice calm but powerful. "This is about the countless victims of an unjust system. This is about dismantling the structures that perpetuate abuse." Officer Roberts thought he was above the law, but today we remind him and the world that no one is above accountability. Daniel watched the footage, his heart sinking lower with every word, every image. The rage he had once wielded with such certainty now felt like an echo from another life. The world was moving on without him, and he was being swept along, powerless to stop it. Imani's resolve. For Imani Sinclair, the weeks following the viral video had been a whirlwind. Her name had become a symbol of strength, of courage in the face of injustice. But with the public spotlight came intense pressure. She had been thrust into a fight that was bigger than her, one that encompassed everything her family had fought for and more. Elijah had been her rock, guiding her through every step, but it was Marcus, her grandfather, who had instilled in her the true meaning of resistance. He would often remind her that it wasn't just about being right. It was about ensuring that those who came after her would never face the same obstacles. "We don't just fight for today, Imani," Marcus would say. "We fight for tomorrow, for the generations that come after. This is bigger than us, bigger than any one person or moment. This is a battle for our future." Imani knew he was right, but that didn't make the pressure any easier to bear. She had become a figurehead of a movement that sought not only justice for herself, but for everyone who had ever been hurt by the very system she had once trusted. Despite the weight of her newfound role, she remained resolute. She knew the fight wouldn't end with one officer, one case, one victory. This was a systemic issue, one that ran deeper than a single incident, and she was prepared to see it through. On one particularly late night, after an exhausting round of interviews and public appearances, Amani sat in her bedroom, scrolling through the messages that had been sent to her. Her phone lit up with a message from an old friend, one of the few who had stayed by her side throughout the entire ordeal. "How are you holding up?" the text read. Amani smiled softly to herself, a rare moment of quiet amidst the chaos. She typed a quick reply, "One day at a time, but we're getting there." And yet, despite her outward composure, there was a quiet fear that lingered beneath the surface. Her life had changed irrevocably. She would never be the same person she had been before that day. The pressure, the constant eyes watching her, the ever-growing expectations, all of it had a toll. But as much as the fear lingered, so did the resolve. She couldn't turn back now. Amani had a job to do, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. Daniel's breaking point. Daniel sat alone in his apartment once again. His once pristine uniform now hung in his closet, gathering dust, a constant reminder of his fall from grace. He had watched the videos, read the comments, seen the interviews. The world had condemned him. And now, there was nothing left but the aftermath. The weight of everything he had lost finally came crashing down. His career, his family, his sense of self, gone. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, lost in the darkness of his thoughts. The pounding in his head grew louder, the crushing guilt that had plagued him for so long threatening to consume him entirely. His fingers hovered over the phone, but for once, he didn't reach for it. He didn't need to hear the voices that had once called him brother, that had once trusted him. They were gone now. Everyone had abandoned him. All he had left was the shame, and the knowledge that he had hurt someone who had done nothing but walk down the street, someone who had been strong when he was weak, someone who had stood tall when he tried to break her. The phone buzzed again, this time an email from his lawyer. He stared at the screen, reading the words in a daze. "We've reviewed the charges. You need to prepare for the worst. The investigation is moving forward. It won't be long before they file criminal charges." The walls seemed to close in as his hands trembled. What had he done? How had he come so far off course? Was there any chance for redemption, or was he too far gone? But in the silence of that moment, one thought repeated in his mind, louder than the others. "You've made your bed. Now, you'll have to lie in it."